So I feel like it's a bit unfortunate. There was some stuff on Metacritic yesterday that I couldn't get to because I was very much enjoying being part of the student project jury. So I didn't get to see what else has been said about Metacritic, but maybe in an exciting way I can contradict it and we'll have some controversy, or maybe it'll be very similar. So the basic premise of this talk this paper was very much about, there are a lot of review sources, and of course it's a lot of players take great deal of interest in review sources and get a lot of important information from all the different review sources. I'm just looking for Catherine Gerling, who I thought had something to say. Great, there you are. So, as we were talking about last night, Catherine, there's a lot of different sources for reviews, and so it makes a great deal of sense, of course, that, there's a body that has sprung up to combine that information, right? So, and I think it's safe to assume everyone knows this, but just in case, the Metacritic website, it provides a weighted average of all the existing reviews using a secret algorithm that no one but they know for you. So if you just want to go to one spot and get a sense of what the general reviews are, they have a professional Metacritic score, which is the weighted algorithm I'm talking about, and then they also have user scores, which anyone can contribute a score to a game on Metacritic as a user. And so, and I hope Jordan's not here because I think this makes him cranky when you talk about this, but there is some evidence that Metacritic scores influence the sales of games. And there's some debate about that obviously I don't have time to go into, but I think we can safely assume there is some connection that occurs. How much influence it has and what scores lead to a difference in sales is a different thing, but there's some link. And I think what there's no debate about is that Metacritic scores can make a huge difference for developers, because publishers, there's deals struck where if you can get a Metacritic score above X, then we'll give you this or that bonus. And I don't know how true that Kotaku article is about the exact figures around Destiny, but I certainly have colleagues who've confirmed for me the specifics of deals they had and how their Metacritic scores had a direct influence on what they as developers got, right? So, these are pretty important things. So the idea behind this work, and I failed to introduce my co-authors at the start of the paper, but Lenart's the only one here who was on the paper, so I should be safe enough. The other two authors aren't here, so we'll just tell them I did that. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to explore this question of which aspects of the player experience are associated with Metacritic scores. So looking at two sort of key sources, we wanted to look at the player experience of need satisfaction, which is the self-determination theory based questionnaire that almost everyone knows. And we also used the GEQ. And I should say, we can't get the GEQ to work the way that it's outlined to work. So our version of the GEQ is like a 6-factor version. You drop 7 items, and negative effect and tension and annoyance become 1 factor. But for the purposes of today, I'll tell you the names of the subscales we use. And looking at the face validity, I think they pretty much measure that, and the reliabilities are good enough, certainly for our purposes. And so what we have is, on the one hand, we have these scales that are very multidimensional. They all have a series of subscales, 5 for the pens and 6 for the GQ. But on the other hand, we have Metacritic scores, which is a very unidimensional, it's a single number. I'm not even sure what less than unidimensional is, but it's a single number, right? So in some ways it's obvious that there's going to be some disconnect between these things, but we wanted to explore which aspects of what as academics and as researchers, we're spending a lot of time on these scales. So what aspects line up with what's happening on Metacritic, and not necessarily expecting that there'd be a huge relationship, but interested in where the relationship was. So we had data from 573 people, reasonably young, quite a lot of university students, but not exclusively, and they're playing a fair bit, sort of an average of 17 hours a week, and we asked them about their current favourite game. So they answered the pens and the GEQ in relation to, I think we said the last 6 months, their current favourite game from the last 6 months. So they answer the pens and the GQ for those items, and then we look at the Metacritic scores for those games, and we see what's going on. So, If this interests you, I think the paper does a much better job of going through all this. I've tried to pick out highlights that I think might be interesting. So all of the pens correlates in some way with professional Metacritic scores. So it seems like there's some association between all the elements of self-determination theory and presence and intuitive controls and a professional Metacritic score. I probably don't have time to... I'm going to just take a punt that everyone's comfortable enough with what a correlation is. I've been at conferences where I got pulled up on that, but I feel like I'm safe in this room. So, and then some of the pens correlates with aspects of user scores. So we've got competence, autonomy and presence there associated with user scores. If we look across at the GQ, sorry, what am I doing? I'm looking at the different screen to you. That's all right, give me a sec. Yep. So if we look at the GQ, it's a little bit patchier. So positive effect and immersion look like they're important for Metacritic professional scores, and challenge, affect, challenge and immersion for user scores. So there's like a couple of pages on what we think might be going on with that in the paper. I'm going to pick out little bits and pieces, but before I do that, I want to sort of talk at a meta level about the fact it looks overall like there are a lot more associations between Metacritic scores and the pens than between Metacritic scores and the GQ. One interpretation of that is support for the value and the relevance of self-determination theory as an understanding of what motivates people to play video games. It could also just be that the pens has had a lot more work on it, I think, in terms of validating it and refining it, so it's just going to stand up a little better in general. And again, we could talk about that for a lot longer. My plan here is to sort of get these numbers, get across these patterns of findings and leave enough time for us to argue about what might be going on. And then, another sort of pattern that emerges is we're getting much higher correlations on most things for professional Metacritic scores than user Metacritic scores. So I think one obvious interpretation of that is that professionals are much better able to judge how a game will satisfy player needs and provide a pleasing experience to the player. But also, as anyone who's been to the Metacritic website knows, Metacritic user scores are pretty idiosyncratic. So you can't really ignore that as a likely influence here. Yeah, so then the exceptions there are you get higher relations for the user scores on positive effect, only a slightly higher thing, but you get a effect for challenge, which you don't get for professional scores. And again, there's a good sort of half page on that in the paper. But really thinking about maybe professional reviewers are trying to review a game in a way that allows for all levels of challenge, whereas a user might be much more in touch with that. So the very different sort of patterns coming across, right? Different patterns of associations. And the correlation between professional and Metacritic scores and user Metacritic scores is really not very high at all. So they're quite disconnected numbers to begin with. But what I think we're overall seeing is that these two groups probably view games in quite different ways, and they may be responding to very different things. And it may be that we put this in, and I think there's debate about it, but maybe professionals are in some cases limited by the deadlines they have to rate a game, or maybe they're looking for different things than players when they play them. You might argue professional reviewers are a little more cynical about video games, and here I was tempted to put up a picture of Destiny and go on a 5-minute rant about what a great game it is and how poor the review scores for it were. But I think, the larger message is that it seems like there's quite different motivations occurring. I think also we can't rule out there's probably really big outliers in the user scores. So there's that whole thing where if you're a Battlefield fan, you just go to the Call of Duty Metacritic page and score it really low. And we can't control for that either. But the strongest associations tended to come out for intuitive controls for professional Metacritic scores, which I think is quite interesting, and autonomy, presence and immersion, just sort of looking at the higher ones. And it may well be that professionals need to pay attention to the quality of the controls because they're providing a review to players of a variety of backgrounds. In contrast, positive effect comes out as the most strong relationship for users, and perhaps that's because really, what else are users thinking about when they rate a game other than whether it made me feel good and I had a good time? And maybe the positive effect score on the GQ is really just, what's the word, like a catch-all for other experiences that maybe we weren't measuring. Again, there's a lot more in the paper on that. But I think one of the most interesting things we found is that in terms of hours of play, professional Metacritic scores don't correlate with hours of play at all. And for user scores, you get a negative correlation with hours of play. So, obviously there's a heap of possible explanations. I think part of what's going on with the professional Metacritic scores is that obviously different genres demand or facilitate different lengths of play, right? So an MMO, you're going to play a lot more than an action-adventure game. But even allowing for that, I think it's quite interesting that there's no relationship at all. I think there might be a disconnect between, and having written reviews and having colleagues who write reviews, there's no sense in which this is slam on professional reviewers at all. But I think the results raise this possibility that there might be a disconnect between what professional review writers are looking for when they're writing a review and what's motivating us as players to play for longer periods of time. I think the negative relationship for user scores, this may be related to the fact that maybe it's, and I'm sure there'll be opinions on this as well, but maybe it's easier to make a shorter game at a really high standard than it is to make a game that goes for a very long time at that same standard. Also, maybe as players, as we play these games for longer and longer, perhaps we become more critical of them as we invest more time in them, and our rating would go down. So, sort of trying to draw some overall kind of connections. There's some overlap between player experience and Metacritic scores. I don't think anyone would argue this, including reviewers, but I don't think professional scores reflect the full complexity of playing a game and why we play a game and what draws us to play a game and how long we play a game. I think that if there is an influence of Metacritic scores on sales, it may exist irrespective of game quality or any specific qualities of the game. And that's something I think that deserves more attention from us as researchers or as players. And I think really basing purchase decisions on Metacritic scores, I think we may be inadvertently missing out on games that we particularly enjoy, particularly if we're looking for something like challenge or relatedness, which is suspiciously absent or very low for the connections that we're seeing. There are a few limitations with this study. We've got relatively small effect sizes, although I think that kind of makes sense given how many things would influence your enjoyment of a game and that we were limited to a couple of scales that we thought were worth a shot. We don't know what the weighting system is for professional Metacritic scores, so we can only speculate about how much influence one or two reviewers is having. As I mentioned earlier, the trolling stuff that goes on with user scores, we can't account for that. Related to that, a different sample, obviously because Metacritic scores are, user Metacritic scores are anonymous, and professional Metacritic scores, it's probably hard to recruit a bunch of professional reviewers to do the pens and the GQ. We don't have the same sample giving us answers to our psychometrics as we do providing the scores. Although I don't think that's the end of the world. We're talking about the play experience of the same game. We also don't have a full range of games in this study. We're asking people about their current favourite games. So none of the games we included had a Metacritic score below 55. So things may change a lot when we start looking at games that didn't fare as well. And of course, the psychometrics we're using are not perfect. They're not a gold, well, we're treating them as somewhat of a gold standard in a roundabout way, but they're obviously not, they're not perfect as yet, or probably ever will be, really. So I guess the larger point to make with this is I think we see this as a starting point of asking some interesting questions. If any of my students did a paper based purely on correlations, they'd be in big trouble, but I've just done that. But I think it's the idea is to sort of generate conversation and think about what we might take further research on it and try and sort of identify some initial patterns that are of interest.